Ethan Caldwell was a man who always had to be right. In his world, success was measured by wins, and he rarely missed a chance to outmaneuver those around him. His charm and his money had opened doors for him everywhere he went, making him almost untouchable. One evening at a high society gala in New York, Ethan's confidence would lead him down a path he never expected. That night, surrounded by laughter and luxury, Ethan's close friend and sometimes rival, Brian, leaned over and tossed out a challenge. "Ethan," Brian said, raising an eyebrow with a sly grin, "I bet you wouldn't dare to marry a woman who isn't your usual perfect 10. Brian's tone was playful, but the challenge was real. Ethan, known for always choosing partners who looked like they belonged on magazine covers, felt a prickle of irritation. But more than that, he felt the thrill of a new game. Ethan's gaze narrowed. "And what's in it for me if I win?" he asked, letting the spark of competition show in his eyes. Brian smirked, lifting his glass. "$1 million to the one who lasts. But there's a catch. You have to stay married to her for at least 6 months." The thought of winning $1 million and the chance to show Brian up was too tempting. Ethan didn't even hesitate. "I'm in," he replied, fully committed to proving he could do it, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. The woman Brian had in mind was Maddie Brooks, someone completely unlike the glamorous women Ethan typically dated. Maddie wasn't a part of Ethan's polished, high-society world. But to Ethan, this was just another business deal, a new way to come out on top. Only a few days later, Ethan received a dossier on Maddie. Strong, independent, with a stubborn streak, she was nothing like the women who usually fell for his charms. Instead of feeling daunted, Ethan felt his interest deepen. He was used to being in control, yet he wondered how someone as grounded as Maddie would respond to his world. Their first encounter was arranged at an upscale restaurant, one of Ethan's favorites. When Maddie walked in, she didn't appear fazed by the opulence or by Ethan himself. She looked him directly in the eyes, her confidence clear and unshaken. "You must be Ethan Caldwell," she said, taking her seat without hesitation. "And you must be Maddie Brooks," Ethan replied with a polite smile, extending his hand. Maddie paused before shaking it, her grip firm and steady, giving Ethan a hint of her resolve. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know about the bet," she stated bluntly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I know the terms, and I know exactly why we're here." Ethan wasn't accustomed to being caught off guard, but Maddie's candor surprised him. Still, he didn't let it show. "Yet, here you are," he replied, intrigued. "If you know everything, why did you agree to meet?" Maddie gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Let's just say I have my reasons. 6 months isn't long, but a lot can change in that time. If you think you can control me, Ethan, you're in for a surprise." Her words left a challenge hanging in the air that made him more curious about her than ever. The night ended with Ethan finding himself unexpectedly fascinated by Maddie. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor was she swayed by the wealth he carried so openly. The encounter left him wondering about what it would take to win her over in the long run. Days passed, and Ethan's thoughts kept returning to Maddie. He was drawn to her independence and her refusal to bow to his status. It was unusual for him to be intrigued by anyone, but Maddie was unlike any woman he'd ever met, and that fact gnawed at him, tempting him to continue the pursuit. Ethan's determination only grew as he thought about his next move. Used to commanding every room he entered, he wasn't about to let Maddie remain an enigma for long. For their second meeting, Maddie suggested a small, cozy cafe, worlds away from the upscale venues Ethan typically frequented. Curious about her, he agreed, though the place was hardly what he would have chosen himself. When he arrived, Maddie was already there, a serene smile on her face as she sipped her tea. She greeted him warmly, showing none of the coldness from their first encounter, though she still exuded that same calm confidence. Maddie looked up at him with a slight smile. "I thought you preferred 5-star restaurants," she teased as he took his seat. "Sometimes it's good to mix things up," he replied, trying to sound casual, though he felt a bit out of his element. Their conversation meandered through surface-level topics, but Maddie soon cut to the chase. "If we're doing this," she began, her voice steady as she set down her cup, "I have a few rules of my own." Ethan was intrigued, his attention drawn fully to her. Go on, he replied, leaning forward, already expecting her to ask for extravagant gifts or special privileges. But Maddie's terms were different, and they surprised him. I'm not interested in your wealth or lifestyle, Ethan, she said, meeting his eyes. This arrangement is for 6 months, and at the end of it, I plan to walk away as the same person I was when I entered it. Don't expect me to change who I am. Ethan found himself studying her more closely. He could tell Maddie was serious, and her directness was refreshing, even challenging. In his world, people were either drawn to his power or intimidated by it, but Maddie was neither. She wanted her independence and made it clear that his wealth held no sway over her. All right, he replied, keeping his tone neutral but feeling a spark of admiration for her. 6 months. After that, we go our separate ways? Maddie nodded, as if sealing their pact. She had a plan of her own, and he could sense her determination. As the weeks passed and the wedding date crept closer, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps this game was more complex than he'd anticipated. Though it started as a simple bet, something about Maddie's spirit challenged him, made him reconsider the stakes. The wedding day came and went in a cold, impersonal fashion, more like a business transaction than a celebration. The ceremony was brief, lacking the joy and emotion that usually accompany such events. But for Ethan, this was a deal to be closed. He was already envisioning himself as the victor, certain that Maddie would eventually warm up to the luxury he could provide. Right after the ceremony, Ethan took Maddie to his lavish penthouse in the heart of Manhattan. With its sprawling glass windows overlooking the city's lights and its meticulously chosen decor, the penthouse was a fortress of wealth. To Ethan, this place was more than a home. It was a testament to his success, the battleground where he would win Maddie over through sheer opulence. But from the moment she stepped inside, Maddie made it clear that she wasn't impressed. She took in the surroundings with a calm, detached gaze before turning to him. 6 months, Ethan. Not a day more, she stated firmly, her words echoing in the vast space. She walked to one of the large windows, staring out at the city lights without any trace of awe. Ethan smirked to himself, feeling confident. He was used to this kind of resistance at first. Many women had tested his patience before eventually surrendering to the allure of his world. He was convinced Maddie would be no different. In the days that followed, Ethan threw everything he could think of at her, from extravagant jewelry to designer clothing, hoping to soften her resolve. He booked luxurious trips and arranged fine dining experiences, expecting that eventually Maddie would start to embrace the lifestyle he envisioned for her. But to his growing frustration, Maddie refused to play along. I don't need any of this, she would say calmly, with a composure that only aggravated him more. Each rejection chipped away at his pride. Ethan was accustomed to having his way, and Maddie's resistance was not only unexpected, it felt personal. What had begun as a bet was turning into a battle of wills, and for the first time in his life, he felt his authority slipping. Determined not to lose, Ethan decided to step up his tactics. He tried to stop Maddie from going to work, making excuses like, "You don't need a paycheck anymore," or "Your role as my wife is enough." When she persisted, he started manipulating their schedules. The days passed in tense silence, and Ethan's frustration began to boil over. He wasn't used to this kind of defiance. Usually, people in his life adjusted to his will, lured by the promise of wealth or the subtle pressure of his influence. But Maddie was different, and every time he tried to press her into the mold he'd created, she only became more defiant. One night, after another day of failed attempts to sway her, Ethan decided to change his approach. He chose a more emotional tactic, hoping that maybe a softer touch would break through where force had failed. "I don't understand you, Maddie," he said, his voice low as he tried to sound sincere. "Why isn't this enough for you? Any other person would feel lucky to have a life like this. What do you actually want?" Maddie didn't flinch, her gaze steady as she looked at him with a quiet intensity. "What do I want, Ethan? I want to be respected. I'm not here to play a role in your life. You think you can control me, that money will make me compliant. But you're wrong. You might have all this wealth, all these things, but inside, you're empty. And that's something you can't buy your way out of." Her words struck a chord he hadn't expected. No one had ever spoken to him that way. It was as if she saw right through the carefully crafted facade he'd spent years building, and the reality of that unsettled him. For the first time, he felt that he might be losing more than just control over the bet. He was beginning to lose himself in this strange, tangled relationship with Maddie. But Ethan was stubborn, determined not to show weakness. Rather than reflecting on her words, he resolved to tighten his grip on her life, convinced he could force her into submission. He started limiting her access to friends, cutting off her professional contacts, even going so far as to interfere with her work. He wanted her to realize that without him, her life would become more difficult than she could bear. Maddie, however, proved to be more resilient than he'd anticipated. Every attempt he made to corner her was met with calm resistance. She was like a rock, standing firm no matter how much pressure he applied. In conversations, she had a way of turning his words back on him, making him feel like the one who was overpowered. Their marriage became a war zone, with small provocations escalating into bitter exchanges. One evening, in a particularly heated moment, Ethan accused her of not appreciating the life he offered. "You have everything here, Maddie," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why do you act like it's not enough? What's it going to take for you to understand that this life is more than most people can dream of?" She looked him in the eye, unwavering. "What's it going to take, Ethan? Respect. You think you can manipulate me, control every aspect of my life just because you're afraid of losing. But that's not love. And I don't need luxury to be fulfilled. I need integrity and dignity, things you can't buy or fake." Her words were a sharp rebuke, one that left him reeling. Ethan, used to bending people to his will, was suddenly the one being pushed back. He felt a strange vulnerability he couldn't place. Maddie's defiance was more than he had anticipated, and with every word she spoke, she tore down the image he had of himself. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Instead, he intensified his efforts, convinced that he could somehow gain the upper hand. He started planning ways to isolate her, thinking that without her connections, she would eventually have to rely on him. He closed doors on potential job offers, sabotaged her efforts in small but damaging ways, and even blocked her from professional circles she once thrived in. Every move he made was calculated, designed to remind her that he held the power. Yet Maddie refused to flinch. Each setback only seemed to strengthen her resolve, and Ethan found himself becoming even more obsessed. Every time he tried to assert control, Maddie held her ground, a silent testament to her strength. She met his attempts at manipulation with calm defiance, as if daring him to try harder. One evening, after another round of strategic moves aimed at isolating her, Maddie approached him, a quiet intensity in her voice. "You think you're in control, don't you?" she asked, her words steady and sharp. "But you have no idea. I have my own plan, Ethan, and one day you'll see that this game you're playing is built on something much bigger than you ever imagined." Her words rattled him. For the first time, he felt an uneasy sense of vulnerability. He'd underestimated her, and the realization shook him. Maddie wasn't merely enduring his tactics, she was playing her own game, one he hadn't foreseen. For the first time, Ethan felt the ground slipping beneath him. In the weeks that followed, the tension in their home grew unbearable. Ethan tried every strategy he could think of, but Maddie resisted him at every turn. Her resilience was unbreakable, and every attempt he made only seemed to bolster her strength. Ethan began to feel as though he was the one on the defensive, his own efforts to control the situation slipping further and further out of his hands. It wasn't long before he found himself obsessively watching her, trying to understand the depths of her resolve. Maddie had become an enigma, and for reasons he couldn't fully comprehend, he found himself captivated by her. She was disarming him in ways no one else ever had, breaking down his defenses and forcing him to see parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime hiding. One night, after a heated argument that left them both on edge, Ethan found himself alone in the living room, staring out at the glittering city beyond his penthouse windows. Normally, the view filled him with a sense of power, a reminder of the empire he'd built. But now, looking out at the lights, he felt a hollow emptiness creeping in. Maddie was supposed to be just another player in his game, a pawn in a bet that would make him $1 million richer. But instead, she was shaking him to his core, revealing a side of himself he'd never acknowledged. The realization was unnerving, leaving him feeling more vulnerable than he had ever been before. Ethan's close friend Brian, the man who had started this whole challenge, noticed the change. During a dinner out one night, Brian watched him closely. "You're different, Ethan," he observed, amusement in his voice. "Usually, you've got everything wrapped up by now. Seems like this woman is getting under your skin in ways I didn't expect." Ethan forced a smile, unwilling to admit how deeply Maddie was affecting him. But Brian's words rang true. Something was changing and Ethan knew it. That night, he returned home determined to put an end to his obsession with control. He needed to face Maddie and settle things once and for all, to reassert his authority and remind himself of who he was. But when he arrived home, he found Maddie seated on the couch, absorbed in a book, unaware of his presence. There was a calmness in her that both frustrated and intrigued him, and he knew he had to speak. "Can we talk?" he asked, breaking the silence that had become the norm between them. Maddie looked up, calm and composed, and closed her book. "Of course," she replied, her expression giving away nothing, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. Ethan sat across from her, gathering his thoughts. He hadn't felt this unsure of himself in years, but he couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. He realized he couldn't keep pretending this marriage was a simple game, that the emotions brewing within him were just a byproduct of the bet. "What are we really doing here, Maddie?" he asked, a touch of vulnerability slipping into his voice. This was supposed to be a bet, a game. But now, I don't know what to think anymore. Maddie regarded him thoughtfully, her gaze steady. "I'm not playing Ethan." "I never was," she replied, her voice soft but full of meaning. "From the beginning, I agreed to this for reasons that go beyond you. I don't care about your money or your need for control. I'm here for something far more important, and if you haven't realized that by now, maybe it's time to open your eyes." Her words left him speechless. He felt as though she had just revealed a hidden truth, one he was only beginning to understand. He knew he couldn't unravel it all at once, but the feeling haunted him. Maddie had her own agenda, a purpose she was determined to fulfill, and for the first time, Ethan felt like the pawn in a game far bigger than himself. The more Ethan thought about Maddie's words, the more he realized he'd been underestimating her from the beginning. She wasn't simply a rebellious spirit resisting his control, she was operating with a purpose he couldn't yet grasp. It haunted him, this feeling of being in the dark, like there was a mystery just beyond his reach that could upend everything. As the days wore on, the atmosphere in their home grew thicker, weighed down by unspoken tension. Ethan's attempts to manipulate the situation were no longer about winning a bet. He had become obsessed with understanding Maddie, trying to peel back her layers and reveal what she was hiding. He'd spent hours thinking about her, analyzing every word, every look, every hint that might tell him why she had agreed to marry him in the first place. Maddie, on the other hand, carried on with her daily routine as if untouched by the turmoil Ethan was experiencing. She kept her distance, almost as if she were waiting for something. It unnerved him, how unshakable she seemed, like a stone fortress he couldn't break through. One evening, after weeks of being drawn deeper into his obsession, Ethan finally broke. He had to know what she was hiding, what secrets lay behind her calm demeanor. It was nearly midnight, and he found her on the balcony, gazing out over the city lights, her silhouette framed against the vast skyline. There was something almost regal about her stance, as though she was looking down on a kingdom only she understood. "Why do you stay so distant?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Maddie didn't turn right away. Instead, she remained quiet, allowing the question to hang in the air. Ethan took a step closer, feeling the pull of her mystery more than ever. "I think you know why," she finally replied, her voice steady and calm. "You think you're the one controlling this game, but you're wrong. I've been in control from the very beginning." Her words chilled him, making him feel as though the ground beneath him was slipping away. All his life, Ethan had been the one calling the shots, the man with the final word. But Maddie had been quietly leading him into a labyrinth of her own design. He tried to mask his shock, but Maddie saw through him. "Do you remember the name Brooks?" she asked, turning to face him fully for the first time. Her eyes held an intensity that made him pause. "The name Brooks," he repeated, frowning as he searched his memory. It was a common enough name, yet the way she said it made it feel loaded with meaning. Yes, Brooks, she said, her voice gaining strength. My father's company was small, barely a blip on your radar. But it meant everything to him. Until you destroyed it. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together fragments of past deals, businesses he'd acquired and dismantled over the years. He couldn't remember every company he'd absorbed or shut down. In his world, companies were just numbers on a balance sheet. But as Maddie's gaze bore into him, he began to realize the depth of what he'd done. What are you saying? He stammered, unable to form the words. His stomach tightened as Maddie took a step toward him, her eyes blazing with emotion. My father was a proud, hard-working man. He had spent his life building that company, providing for his family. And you, her voice caught, anger flashing across her face. You swept in with your empire and took everything. You crushed him. And in the end, it destroyed him. He lost his business, his pride, everything he'd worked for. And when he couldn't bear the weight of it anymore, he took his own life. Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He felt an overwhelming wave of nausea as the gravity of her accusations settled over him. He was paralyzed, unable to find any words to defend himself. He had made countless deals, some of them ruthless, but he'd never paused to consider the lives affected beyond his own. Maddie, I didn't know, he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know who you were. That's right, she replied bitterly. Because you never cared to know. To you, my father was just a name on a piece of paper, another obstacle to clear on your path to success. While you were basking in luxury, my family was torn apart. My mother and I lost everything, down to the last scrap of dignity, because of you. Ethan tried to speak, to find some way to express his remorse, but every word felt hollow, inadequate. Maddie's pain was raw, tangible, and he felt it cut into him like a knife. But I planned this, Ethan, she continued, her voice hardening with resolve. When I learned about the bet, I saw an opportunity. I accepted your challenge not because I wanted your money or your lifestyle, but because I wanted you to know what it feels like to be played, to be manipulated and controlled. I wanted you to feel powerless, just as my family felt powerless in the face of your greed. Ethan felt his legs weaken as he sank into a nearby chair, the weight of Maddie's words pressing down on him. This entire time, he'd believed he was in control, that he held the power over her. But Maddie had been guiding him down this path all along, setting him up for a truth that would shatter the very foundation of his identity. I never thought, he began, struggling to hold back his own emotions. I didn't know. I never imagined the consequences. I thought it was just business. Maddie looked at him with a mixture of anger and disappointment. That's exactly it, Ethan. To you, it was just business. But to the people whose lives you've torn apart, it's everything. And you'll never understand that until you've lived it yourself. Her words echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of the devastation he'd caused. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He had been so focused on winning, on building his empire, that he'd lost sight of the human cost. And now, standing before Maddie, he felt stripped bare, his entire world unraveling before him. The next few days passed in a blur of guilt and shame. Maddie kept her distance, but her presence was a constant reminder of the pain he had inflicted, of the lives he had torn apart without a second thought. For the first time, Ethan was forced to confront the reality of his actions, and the weight of it nearly broke him. One morning, desperate for some form of redemption, he approached her as she prepared to leave the apartment. Maddie, he said, his voice cracking, I know I can never undo what I've done. I know I can't bring back your father or erase the suffering I caused. But please, tell me what I can do now. Tell me how I can make amends. Maddie paused, turning to face him with an unreadable expression. You want to make amends, Ethan? She asked softly. You can start by facing the truth, by understanding that for every victory you've claimed, there's someone out there who lost everything. And maybe, just maybe, if you truly understand that, you can begin to change. Ethan nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. He realized he had a long road ahead, one that would require him to confront not just Maddie's pain, but the pain of countless others who had been hurt by his ambition. It was a journey he didn't know how to begin, but he was willing to try, if only for the chance to rebuild something real with Maddie. As she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts, Ethan felt the crushing weight of accountability settle over him. For the first time, he understood that winning wasn't everything, that there were consequences he could no longer ignore. And in that moment, he resolved to change, to become a man who could one day be worthy of Maddie's forgiveness, even if it took a lifetime. In the days following Maddie's revelation, Ethan was forced to confront the reality of who he was and the lives he had affected. The weight of her words hung over him like a dark cloud, relentlessly reminding him of the devastation he had caused. It was a feeling he'd never had to grapple with before, and the enormity of it left him hollow, haunted by the faces of people he'd barely remembered, people who had lost everything so he could build his empire. Ethan could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, fragments of memories would rise up, scenes of meetings where he'd signed contracts to shut down smaller companies without a second thought. Maddie's father was one of countless casualties in his quest for power, and he'd never once paused to consider the people behind those names. Until now. Determined to find some semblance of redemption, Ethan took the first step, facing Maddie. One evening, he found her standing on the balcony, staring out over the city lights, wrapped in thought. He approached her quietly, unsure of how to begin. Maddie didn't turn to face him, keeping her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maddie," he began, his voice carrying a rawness he couldn't conceal. "I don't know if anything I say will matter, but I need you to know, I am truly sorry. I didn't understand the cost of my actions. I never stopped to think of the lives I was affecting. All I saw were numbers." Maddie remained silent, her posture rigid and unyielding. Ethan's heart pounded as he struggled to put words to the weight he felt inside. He was used to being composed, guarded, but here he stood, stripped bare, his defenses crumbling before her. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if there's any way I can make things right, I'll do it. Not just for you, but for all the people I hurt." Finally, Maddie turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "And what does that even mean, Ethan? You can't bring back what was lost. You can't undo the damage you caused. You can't bring back my father." Her voice was calm but laced with pain. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the full brunt of her words. "I know. And that's the hardest part. But I want to change. I want to be someone better. Someone who deserves forgiveness, even if it's never granted." Maddie studied him for a moment, as though weighing the sincerity of his words. "Words are easy, Ethan. They're just sounds that disappear into the air. Real change takes action. Are you ready to confront the people whose lives you destroyed?" Ethan nodded, her challenge piercing him to his core. "I'll do whatever it takes," he replied, a newfound determination sparking within him. He realized this wasn't just about making amends to Maddie, it was about transforming himself, reshaping his life in a way he never thought possible. Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into a path of redemption. He began reaching out to those he had wronged, tracking down small business owners whose livelihoods he'd crushed. He arranged meetings, sitting face-to-face with people who looked at him with the same mixture of anger and pain he saw in Maddie's eyes. Each conversation forced him to confront a side of himself he'd tried to ignore. He offered reparations, donated to charities supporting struggling entrepreneurs, and set up recovery funds for those he had impacted. It was a humbling experience, one that stripped him of his former arrogance. Every time he returned home after these encounters, he felt exhausted, drained by the realization of what his ambition had cost others. And yet, for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his own wealth and success. Maddie watched his efforts from a distance, cautious and wary. She saw him transforming, and though she didn't openly acknowledge it, she felt a quiet admiration growing. Ethan was becoming someone different, someone who no longer clung to the cold detachment that had once defined him. But Maddie wasn't ready to trust him, not yet. Her wounds ran deep, and she knew that trust wouldn't come easily. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with a family he'd wronged, Ethan came home and found Maddie standing by the window, looking out over the city. She turned as he entered, her expression softening ever so slightly. "How was it?" she asked, her voice carrying a gentleness he hadn't heard from her before. "It was harder than I thought," he admitted, his voice laced with fatigue. "I met with a man today whose life was upended by one of my deals. He lost everything. His home, his family. Hearing his story was—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Maddie nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not easy to face the truth, is it? The reality of what we've done." "No," he replied, a raw honesty in his voice. "But I need to face it no matter how painful it is. I can't live in denial anymore. I want to be different, Maddie. I want to be someone better." Maddie's expression softened, a small flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. Though she wasn't ready to forgive him fully, she could see that he was genuine, that he was working toward a change she hadn't believed possible. For the first time, she felt as though they might be able to move forward, not as a couple bound by a bet, but as two people seeking redemption in their own ways. In the days that followed, Ethan continued his efforts, and though Maddie kept her guard up, she began allowing small moments of connection to creep back into their relationship. They shared brief conversations over breakfast, exchanged polite but genuine words in the evenings, and little by little, the walls between them began to crack. One night, as they sat together in a rare moment of peace, Ethan reached out to her. "I know I've hurt you, Maddie. I know I may never earn your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm not giving up. I'm going to keep trying, no matter how long it takes." Maddie looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a man she hadn't believed existed. A man capable of growth, humility, and even compassion. She felt her own resolve weaken, a tiny glimmer of hope flickering within her. "We'll see, Ethan," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "We'll see if you can truly change." As the days slipped into weeks, a tentative rhythm began to settle between Ethan and Maddie. Though the past still lingered like an unspoken shadow, there was an undeniable shift in their dynamic. Ethan, once consumed by ambition and the thrill of power, was now driven by something deeper, an urge to prove he was capable of change, of becoming someone worthy of Maddie's trust, if not her forgiveness. Maddie, too, felt the gradual thaw. She no longer looked at Ethan with the same bitterness. Instead, she observed his small, consistent efforts, noting how he no longer held the same cold confidence in his gaze. He was softer now, more introspective, like a man shedding his former skin and realizing, perhaps for the first time, the weight of his choices. One evening, Ethan returned home visibly drained. Maddie was seated at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. He joined her without saying a word, sinking into the chair across from her. "They're hard to face, aren't they?" Maddie said, breaking the silence as she glanced at him, her voice gentle but probing. "The people whose lives you affected?" Ethan nodded, rubbing his hands together thoughtfully. "Every time I sit across from one of them, I see a part of myself reflected back, this ruthless version of me that I hardly recognize now. It's strange, Maddie, but I feel like I'm confronting a stranger, someone I don't want to be anymore." She looked at him with a faint, sad smile, recognizing the sincerity in his words. "The man you were, he was a stranger to me too. But this," she gestured toward him, toward the quiet vulnerability that had replaced his former arrogance. "This is different." Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a warmth he hadn't felt in months. Maddie's words, though guarded, were the closest she'd come to acknowledging his efforts. He knew he couldn't rush her, that forgiveness was still a distant possibility, but her softened demeanor gave him the strength to keep going. Over the following weeks, Maddie and Ethan fell into a tentative companionship. They shared meals together, engaged in quiet conversations about inconsequential things, her favorite books, his childhood memories, small fragments of themselves they hadn't thought to share before. The walls between them were still there, but each day, a little more of the distance faded. One chilly evening, Maddie found herself sitting beside Ethan on the balcony, wrapped in a thick blanket as they looked out over the glittering city below. She had rarely felt this sense of calm in his presence, a calm that felt almost surreal considering their past. Ethan leaned back, gazing out at the skyline, his expression contemplative. "Have you ever thought about what you want, Maddie?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Beyond all this, beyond the pain and the past, what do you see for yourself? Maddie hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She'd spent so long thinking about the things she'd lost, the betrayal she'd endured, that she hadn't given much thought to her future. But as she considered Ethan's words, a vision slowly began to form. "I want freedom, Ethan," she replied softly. "I want to live a life that isn't dictated by anyone else's choices. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and see someone who's strong, someone who didn't let her pain define her." Ethan listened quietly, absorbing her words. He realized that Maddie's strength, the very thing he'd once tried to break, was also the quality he'd come to admire most in her. She wasn't simply a woman hardened by grief. She was someone who'd endured, who'd refused to let the world shape her into something she wasn't. As they sat in silence, Ethan reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. Maddie tensed but didn't pull away, allowing the quiet gesture to linger between them. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of something that went beyond obligation, beyond redemption. It was a spark of genuine connection, something fragile and new, but unmistakably real. "Maddie," he began, his voice low, "I know I've said this before, but thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to be something more than I was. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." She looked at him, her gaze softening. "This isn't about deserving, Ethan. It's about change. Real change. And maybe, just maybe, you're starting to understand what that means." The night continued quietly, the air between them filled with an unspoken understanding. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever. But it was something that felt real, a bond forged from shared pain, resilience, and the slow process of healing. In the weeks that followed, their tentative companionship grew. Maddie allowed herself to lower her guard, letting Ethan into her life in small but significant ways. They began cooking together, sharing stories about their pasts, revealing fragments of themselves they'd once kept hidden. Each moment was a step forward, a brick laid on the fragile foundation they were building. But despite the progress, Maddie could sense a lingering tension within herself. She knew Ethan was doing everything he could to prove himself, to show her that he had changed, but the scars of her past still held her back. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully trust him, if the walls she'd built to protect herself would ever fully come down. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Maddie finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at her. "Ethan," she began, her tone hesitant, "what would you do if I couldn't ever forgive you completely? If I couldn't let go of what happened?" He looked at her, the seriousness of her question settling over him. "Then I would keep going, Maddie. Even if you can't forgive me, I would keep trying. Because I want to be better, not just for you, but for myself. For the people I've hurt. Forgiveness would be a gift, but I don't need it to keep working towards something better." His response surprised her, filling her with a quiet sense of hope she hadn't expected. She realized that, perhaps, forgiveness wasn't the end goal. Maybe it was simply about learning to coexist with the past, about finding a way to move forward despite the pain. And so, they continued. Each day was a new step, a new opportunity to rebuild what had once been broken. Maddie's heart began to soften, though she remained cautious, knowing that trust would take time. But as she looked at Ethan, truly looked at him for the first time, she saw a man who was trying, a man who was no longer defined by the ruthless ambition that had once driven him. One night, as they stood together on the balcony, Maddie felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know if they would ever truly be together, if they would ever find the love that had eluded them for so long. But in that moment, with the city lights casting a warm glow around them, she knew that they had both come a long way. For the first time, she reached out to him, her hand slipping into his. Ethan looked at her, surprised but grateful, his gaze filled with something that went beyond words. And as they stood there, side by side, Maddie felt a quiet certainty growing within her, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. They were no longer the people they had been. They were something new, something forged from pain and redemption, from resilience and understanding. And though the future remained uncertain, they were ready to face it together. As winter turned to spring, Ethan and Maddie's relationship continued to evolve. They'd moved from bitterness to understanding, from anger to a fragile but undeniable bond. They hadn't said the words out loud, hadn't labeled what was between them, but there was a mutual respect and affection that hadn't existed before. One evening, while they shared a quiet dinner, Ethan looked across the table and felt a warmth he hadn't known he was capable of. Maddie had become his anchor, his reminder of the life he was trying to lead, the man he wanted to become. Her presence had a grounding effect on him, making him see the world in a way he'd never considered before. "Maddie," he began, his tone thoughtful, "have you ever thought about leaving all of this behind? Starting somewhere new, away from the shadows of the past?" She looked up, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Sometimes," she admitted. "There are days when I wonder what it would be like to just disappear, to live a simple life far from all this." The idea lingered in the air between them, both of them considering the weight of their pasts and what it would mean to truly start over. Ethan felt a rush of inspiration, a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "What if we did?" he suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we left, together, and rebuilt something entirely new? No more games, no more bets." Maddie's eyes searched his, and for a long moment, she said nothing. She had always dreamed of freedom, of a life unburdened by pain, but the idea of taking that leap, of trusting someone again, filled her with a quiet fear. Yet, as she looked at Ethan, she saw a man who was no longer bound by his past, a man who had changed in ways she hadn't thought possible. "Are you sure, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her vulnerability. "This isn't just a way to escape. It's a commitment, a choice to leave behind everything we've known." He nodded, his expression unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything. I don't need the money, the power, or the success. None of it means anything without someone to share it with. I want to be with you, Maddie. Not as a prize, but as my partner." The sincerity in his voice melted the last remnants of her resistance. She realized she'd been waiting for this moment, for the chance to finally let go of her pain and step into a new chapter, one filled with the possibility of love, trust, and redemption. Slowly she reached out, her hand finding his. "Then let's do it," she said, her voice steady. "Let's start over. Together." They spent the next few weeks making plans, disentangling themselves from the life they'd built around power, wealth, and reputation. They sold the penthouse, liquidated assets, and set up charitable foundations to help the people Ethan had once hurt. He wanted to leave behind something that would continue to make a difference, something that would outlast his mistakes. Finally, they left the city, trading the chaos of New York for a quiet, coastal town where they could live a simpler life, a life defined by each other rather than by their pasts. They found a small house by the ocean, far from the shadows of their former lives, and for the first time, they felt free. The adjustment wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of their pasts resurfaced, when the echoes of old habits threatened to pull them back. But in those moments, they leaned on each other, finding solace in the connection they had built. As they settled into their new life, they began to rediscover themselves in ways they hadn't anticipated. Maddie took up painting, channeling her emotions into art that reflected the journey they had both endured. Ethan found peace in working with his hands, taking up woodworking and building furniture for their home. Their lives became an expression of the resilience and transformation they had both fought so hard to achieve. One evening, as they stood on the beach watching the sunset, Ethan slipped his arm around Maddie's shoulders, pulling her close. The past no longer held the power it once had, no longer defined who they were. They were free, free to love, free to forgive, and free to live a life built on understanding and trust. Looking out over the endless horizon, Maddie felt a quiet peace settle within her. She knew their journey had been anything but conventional, marked by betrayal, pain, and redemption. But as she leaned against Ethan, she realized that they had found something rare, something worth every trial they had endured. Together, they had crafted a life that was real, a love born not from perfection but from resilience, from the decision to forgive and rebuild. And in that moment, standing by the ocean with Ethan's arm around her, Maddie knew she had finally found the freedom she had always longed for. They had left their pasts behind, and for the first time, they were truly home. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your interest and support inspire us to bring you more captivating tales filled with emotions, twists, and the complexity of life, love, betrayal, and redemption. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We value your voice and want to hear what you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Thank you for bringing this channel to life with your views and encouragement. See you in the next story.